Good evening and welcome to our special coverage of the war in Ukraine. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
And I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Kyiv mayor announces a 35-hour curfew for people in the capital, warning of a difficult and dangerous moment.
Prime Ministers of Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovenia travel to Kyiv for talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Plus, President Zelensky pleads with European nations to send Ukraine more weapons.
Thanks for staying with us. It's day 20 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Moscow's offensive is edging closer to central Kyiv, even as the two countries keep open a narrow diplomatic channel with more planned talks.
Shortly before dawn, a series of Russian strikes hit a residential neighborhood in the capital, igniting a huge fire and frantic rescue efforts in a 15-story apartment building. Let's take a look at the key developments from today so far.
Kyiv awoke to the sound of air raid sirens for a second day as two powerful explosions rocked the Ukrainian capital before dawn. Officials say at least 4 people have been killed after a strike hit a residential building in the city. The mayor has announced a 35-hour curfew.
We will defend our city. It's our homes. We never think to leave. It's our homes. We defend our children, family, our buildings, our city, and our future of Ukraine.
The city has been spared the worst of the fighting so far, but the Russian military is slowly closing in on the city, and shelling has intensified. Ukraine plans to evacuate civilians and deliver humanitarian aid to those trapped by Russian forces through 9 humanitarian corridors today. This includes to the besieged city of Mariupol, which has been under constant bombardment, leaving hundreds of thousands of residents sheltering without water or power for almost a week. According to the United Nations, more than 3 million people have now fled Ukraine since Russia invaded on February 24. Meanwhile, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine continue today. Ukrainian President Zelensky published another video message overnight where he sounded a note of cautious optimism about the talks. And speaking at a meeting of Joint Expeditionary Force leaders, the Ukrainian president says Europe must protect its own security by helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia, urging them to send more weapons.
So we all are the targets of Russia, and everything will go against Europe if Ukraine won't stand. So I would like to ask you to help yourself by helping us. You know the kind of weapon we need, everyone knows. You know what kind of defense measures we need. You know what the dire need is, the fighter jets, and without your support it would be very difficult. And we want you to help us, and I do hope that you will be able to enhance that scope, and you will see how this will protect your security, your safety, and how that will make a stable peace not only for us but for your country.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is hosting the summit of Nordic and Baltic leaders to discuss European defence and security.
Nobody wants to be engaged in a direct military confrontation between the West and Russia. Clearly that's not something that any of us want to see. But we recognize that it is our duty to support the Ukrainian people in their hour of need, and particularly to support the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky. I think already it is clear that Putin has gravely miscalculated. He's underestimated the heroism and determination of the Ukrainians to resist under President Zelensky. I think he's also gravely underestimated the unity of the West, which is expressed not least in this meeting today.
In the meantime, the EU has unveiled its 4th set of sanctions against Russia, aimed at crippling its ability to finance the invasion.
That's the strongest package of sanctions ever adopted by the European Union in its history. That's a historical decision. You will have more than 600 Russian people targeted. I don't want to give any name, but you will have more than 600 Russian people being targeted by those sanctions. You will have a large part of the financial system being targeted by those sanctions. You will have a new ban on some exportation like the luxury goods. And we will withdraw to the Russian state the most favored nation clause within the World Trade Organization, which will allow us, all the 27 member states, to increase the level of trade tariffs on all Russian goods. On all Russian goods.
A further 370 Russian individuals and entities have been hit by UK sanctions that include asset freezes and travel bans. This list includes former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. The UK has also hit Russia with trade restrictions, including an additional 35% tariff on vodka.
A lot of destruction in Ukraine today, but after nearly 3 weeks of war, Russia has failed to establish military dominance over Ukraine. Despite the death and destruction caused by the Russian attack, Ukraine's military has held up better than experts predicted, and Russian advances have been slower than feared.
Well, joining us to speak about both countries' military strategy is security analyst Mr. Chidi Nwano. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
It's 20 days into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has become apparent Russia's military is experiencing failures, and that is if you agree. It has one of the world's largest military forces, doesn't it? Do you think President Putin's strategy in Ukraine has not gone according to plan?
So there's several factors to this that we need to kind of lay out first. Is that the strategy of President Putin is somewhat unknown. We don't know whether he genuinely intended to, I think the word I'm looking for is if he intends to take over Ukraine or if he just intends to destroy their army and their government. The strategy doesn't necessarily make sense looking at it purely from a military point of view. So we can't say we know what the strategy is. Operationally, the Russians are struggling. That's the polite way of putting it. However, they are still achieving their objectives. They have almost completed the encirclement of Ukrainian forces in the east, which is some of Ukraine's best forces. They've almost completed the encirclement of Kyiv. They've isolated the Black Sea ports and besieged the cities, or most of the Black Sea cities, cutting Ukraine off from the coast, and they've captured Kherson. So operationally, they're achieving their objectives, but they're doing it in a very difficult, bloody way, and they're losing a lot of men and a lot of material, which puts into question whether they can sustain this operation for much longer.
Indeed. In terms of the strategy of the Ukrainians, what do you make of President Zelensky asking European nations for more weapons?
Well, President Zelensky is fighting two wars. He's fighting the conventional war, or his troops are fighting the conventional war, and they're making good use of the weapons which have been provided by the European Union and by the Americans and by their other friends and allies. So again, this goes back to how the Russians have a weird strategy and a bad operation to isolate their troops and allow themselves to be vulnerable to the kind of handheld weapons which the Ukrainians have been supplied. So by not fighting their forces as they're designed to fight, these battalion tactical groups which should be fighting as a solid unit with their armor protected by the infantry, they've allowed their armor to be isolated, and they destroyed it piecemeal by these handheld weapons by the Ukrainians. But the information warfare war by the Ukrainians, again, is on point. So you've seen President Zelensky moving around with his troops. He's always unshaven, wearing a T-shirt, looking like a man of the people, a man completely different from his opponent, President Putin, who's always in a suit, aloof, far away from his advisors. So President Zelensky's statement should be seen as part of this information war, in which he needs the European nations to not get combat fatigue and not suddenly get tired of the Ukrainian problem. He needs them to keep himself front and center, to keep the problem front and center, and make sure they keep supplying him with the weapons he needs.
So the Russian forces have stalled outside major cities of Ukraine. Do you think that is as a result of the offensive they're receiving from the Ukrainian forces, or that is a failure on the part of Russia because from this point on it's still strategizing how else to enter many of those cities?
So it's a little bit of both. So the Russian original plan, as far as we can see at this point, was to shock the Ukrainians with airstrikes and artillery, and then moving with light forces and quickly capture these areas. The Ukrainian resistance was much stronger. As I've alluded to, they completely destroyed the light forces. So particularly around Kyiv, the Russian airborne forces have been almost completely decimated in their attempts to take Kyiv and also take the areas around Kyiv. However, what the Russians are doing now is operationally sound. They're surrounding these cities, cutting off their supply lines and reducing them through bombardment. So whilst the bombardment might not be striking military targets, it's destroying the ability of these cities to sustain themselves. And this is winter in Ukraine, or it's going into spring. It's cold. Water pipes, once they're burst, will freeze. The civilian population will suffer. So it's a way of making the Ukrainians surrender without having to commit forces. If the commit forces to go into the cities, as I said, they do not have the forces to do that. It's a huge combat resource intensive fight, which the Russians have shown already by fighting in the open areas they do not have.
So, well, you speak about surrender, and, some say that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, should surrender. He had no idea what he was going into when he decided to take on Russia in this war. But he wants to negotiate. What do you think that involves? And, what exactly are his strong points here?
So again, now I've heard those statements, and they generally don't make much sense, because I think Ukraine was invaded. They did not attack Russia. Russia attacked Ukraine. So I don't think he had much choice in the matter. I don't think surrender is an option for any Ukrainian leader. As you can see from the Ukrainian people themselves, there is a strong belief in themselves. This is the Ukraine's kind of national moments. This is what all of them coming together. It's like the Blitz in Britain during the Second World War. Everyone is coming together. Any Ukrainian government that tries to surrender will be overthrown. So I don't think Zelensky has a choice other than to keep the fight going. For the negotiation, he has many strong points in that he holds the capital. He still holds several key cities. As I said, for now, his forces in the east are still holding, and he has the west. So the west of Ukraine is heavily forested. It's a very good country for the kind of warfare the Ukrainians are fighting, light mobile forces against the heavy road-bound Russian forces, and the Ukrainians would cause a lot of damage there. He also has his supply lines into the west, into Poland, into Slovakia, into Romania, into Hungary, NATO countries where he can get weapons, where he can get equipment. So he's got a lot of points on his cards to play. But the question is, what price will Ukraine pay in terms of lives and property destroyed?
In terms of the bombardments, what role would you say Kyiv plays in all of this? If Russia captures Kyiv, how will it affect this invasion and then the negotiations? So
this is the part of the conundrum that President Putin has got himself into. And by making Kyiv a target, he's fixed himself around Kyiv. If he doesn't take Kyiv, every day that he doesn't take Kyiv, it's a victory for the Ukrainians. But in order to take Kyiv, he either has to bombard it into surrender, or he has to send his troops in, and which they'll be destroyed. It will be Grozny or Stalingrad all over again. So Kyiv falling, but the problem is Kyiv falling doesn't end the war. Even if Zelensky is killed or captured, it doesn't end the war. The government will move to Lviv, or if Lviv is captured, which is very unlikely, it will move further into the west of Ukraine or into Poland or some other country. It will not end the war. It will simply change as I said, cause a lot of destruction, kill a lot of people, and it will kill a lot of Russians. So there is still a strong hand for the Ukrainians to hold on to Kyiv. And as I said, even if Kyiv falling, it doesn't end the war in Russia's favor.
And talking about, the bombardments we're seeing in Kyiv, bombarding some of the flats there as well, and, living areas, people are saying that some experts have said that, there's a possible war crimes. But if you look at the humanitarian front, we've had casualties as well. Who should take responsibility? the deaths of refugees, for example, from hypothermia, exhaustion, close to the borders as they try to flee?
So this is a very interesting question, and it's something that legal scholars will have to kind of thrash out as this conflict progresses, because there are responsibilities that are put on all parties to a conflict, and that's there is the law of armed conflict in which you're supposed to use proportionality, you're supposed to use discrimination, so discriminate between civilian targets and military targets, and not use excessive forces. The Russians can argue that when they're firing into Kyiv or into built-up areas, they're targeting military installations. So, for example, if the Ukrainians have any sort of military asset, be it a weapon system or even a person in an apartment building, that makes it a military target, and the Russians can argue that they thought it was a military target. In terms of responsibility for this, the brutal answer is whoever wins the war. So whoever wins the war will dictate how the peace, is written. If the Russians win, then they will blame everything on the Ukrainian government, and that will be the end of it. If the Ukrainians win, then it will be the Russians' fault, and they will have grounds to either take the Russian government to court or seek reparations, or what other kind of measures they can take. But beyond the legalities of it, it's the victors write the peace. So it's kind of difficult to say at this point.
Yeah, and I did hear a UK official say that Russia's strategy is not working. Russia is losing the war, which is why it's attacking civilians. But as to responsibility, whose responsibility will it then be to rebuild Ukraine when this war is over?
That's another very interesting question. So, if the Ukrainians win, and win is a very amorphous statement, so if the Ukrainians manage to force the Russians if the Russians, for example, suffer a catastrophic defeat, the Ukrainians take thousands and thousands of prisoners, and the Russians have no option but to sue for peace, they could ask for reparations as part of the peace deal. It's unlikely that that will happen because the Russians have quite a few trump cards to play. In reality, what's most likely going to happen is that the EU and the US will help rebuild Ukraine. It's most likely what will happen is that Russian assets that have been seized around the world, this is again a speculation, so please don't take this as fact, but it's likely that Russian assets have been seized around the world, might be liquidated and used to rebuild Ukraine. But at the same time, you can guarantee that the EU and the US and other countries would invest heavily in rebuilding Ukraine after this war.
And when does military fatigue then set in? They've been on for 3 weeks. The Russians launching their attacks, the Ukrainian forces resisting. And then you spoke about President Volodymyr Zelensky still looking fresh, appearing in his video statements without his advisors around him. He still looks, just like he did on the first day the war started, although I'm sure this has taken a toll on him. But when does military fatigue set in for either side?
For the soldiers, I'm sure military fatigue has set in a long time ago. But for the politicians, what I'm going to say is not going to be very pleasant, but a lot more people are going to have to die before this war will end. For the person who started this war, President Putin, he needs a victory, and it could be, if we're very fortunate, that victory could be he captures Kyiv, he declares that he's won the war and pulls out his troops, or he could go for the maximalist objectives that he set at the beginning, which is the denazification of Ukraine, which means essentially removing its government, and the demilitarization, which means destroying its army, which means a very long and bloody war. What one hopes is that he will find a convenient way to call a ceasefire and pull his troops back. But right now, he hasn't been handed a kind of decisive defeat, kind of overt use as an excuse to end the war. So unfortunately, until that happens, and I think the Battle of Kyiv will be one of those decision points. If he loses it, that's going to be problematic. He either has to double down or he has to pull back. If he wins it, he has the option of declaring victory, saying he's achieved all his war aims and pulling out, and then hopefully that will be the end of the war.
Keep watching as events unfold. Many thanks, security analyst Chidi Wano. Thank you for joining us on the program. Well, Russia says it will stop its invasion when the goals of its special military operation are achieved in Ukraine, including demilitarization. Moscow's ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia, says it will also put forth its own draft of resolution in the meantime regarding humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
Mexico came with a humanitarian resolution on the situation in Ukraine. It has been already more than a week that they introduced the initial draft, and we said from the very beginning that we would be prepared to adopt a humanitarian resolution on the situation in Ukraine, provided that this is not a disguise to blame and shame Russia again. We made it clear that we would be prepared to adopt a humanitarian resolution. So I think that the chances are still there, and that's why we will put forward our own draft, which is humanitarian, and we will put it into the blue shortly, and we'll see whether the Security Council can or cannot fulfill its mission to adopt a resolution which will be on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine with clear humanitarian provision like call for negotiated ceasefire, evacuation of civilians, the respect of international humanitarian and human rights law, condemnation of attacks against civilians and civilian objects, safe and unhindered passage, unhindered access of humanitarian assistance, etc.
In the meantime, Russia's defense ministry says its troops have taken full control of Ukraine's southern region of Kherson as the Russian military campaign continues for the 20th day. According to Konashinov, a grouping of DPR, that's the Donetsk People's Republic troops, in the process of carrying on its offensive, broke through the defenses of Ukrainian nationalists. The city of Kherson, the provincial capital of nearly 250,000 people, was the first key urban center to be captured by Russian troops after Moscow launched a military campaign against Ukraine on February 24th.
Well, social media companies have in recent years grappled with how to handle misinformation, conspiracy theories about a pandemic, a presidential election, and insurrection, often while facing intense criticism from lawmakers for doing too little or too much. Now the platforms are scrambling to confront a growing list of challenges, some of which appear to be almost unheard of in their histories, as war starts in Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Our technology correspondent Victor Matthias speaks with experts on sifting through the facts from fiction. Victor?
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Amarachi. Welcome to this end of the program. So like you just gave that brief intro, indeed, I'll be speaking to experts, and I have joining me Mayawati Jani. He is a lead fact-check journalist with Facebook. He's the lead fact-checking journalist with AFP Fact Check, and we also have Boye Adegoke. He is the senior programs manager at Paradigm Initiative. It's a pleasure to have both of you join us today on the program. Maiwa, kickstart the conversation for us. Just share a bit of what you found. I mean, in all of this, now looking at fake news, we've seen so much. We've seen actually a lot of stuff being shared out there, but what have you found that, went viral that wasn't true?
Okay, so we've gotten quite a number of videos, especially on our end. And what is peculiar about this kind of videos, and maybe a lot more on TikTok these days, is the fact that the general language spoken in Russia is not anything that this part of the world is familiar with. So if you're listening to the Russian president speak in his native language, you can only pick names. Say, if he mentions America or if he mentions Joe Biden, then you can hear that. But what he's saying in essence, if you don't understand language, you cannot make sense of it. So what people are doing is they are taking those kind of native videos and they are subtitling it. But now the subtitles are made in such a way that they say what whoever is editing the video wants it to say. So we've seen videos of Putin claiming to be threatening Nigeria, threatening African countries, threatening Kenya. And of course, some of those have really gone viral and a lot of people have sort of panicked about it. We've had many people send those kind of videos to us. And when we do a little analysis on video, we find out that what he's saying is entirely different from the subtitles that we're seeing there. And this is like viral on TikTok right now.
All right. Let me just bring in Boye into the conversation. Boye, prior to now, what role would you say social media has played, in fueling this war?
Yeah. So what I would say with respect to that is that first, it's a pleasure to be here again. But in response to your question, I think this is not one of those conflicts that you really want to scapegoat social media for starting. Because if you look at the issues that led to this war, it has nothing to do with what people are saying on social media fueling it. It's a very deep issues around Putin or Russia trying to assert or trying to expand its sphere of influence in that region of the world. So I wouldn't say social media play a role in causing the conflict. But then, of course, like Mayowa said, the problem is that once the ball has been set rolling, one of the challenges that you face in this age is the problem with disinformation, people spreading false information, conspiracy theories, of course, propaganda, and also it's known that, in fact, one of the strategies that the Russian government has used over time is also propaganda, trying to control narratives and all that. So there are state-sponsored actors who are also, on social media trying to shape narrative around. But I wouldn't say you can trace the cause to that. It's just one of the tools for me of warfare for Russia in particular.
So we've seen now in trying to control the narrative, like you said, we've seen that, what's it called? Instagram has actually, gone against its rules, so to speak now. And that has left Russia with no choice than to ban Instagram, blocking access, to social media platforms for some 80 million users across the Russian state. I mean, was that necessary?
Yeah, that's one decision that I did not think was necessary, and it's also unfortunate. But then it underscores Western influence on these platforms. You cannot deny the fact that these platforms has a lot of Western influence, and because the Western government were sanctioning Russia, so it was almost like they were just following, going into that direction. And I feel it's lack of awareness for the platform to have taken that type of decision, because these platforms have become very global and they have to be very conscious of that when taking decisions. It's understandable that there is a lot of global outcry against Russian invasion, but when it comes to the platforms, in terms of what the platforms are used for, it's very tricky in terms of the kind of policy you initiate in situations like this, because as much as you want to probably join in punishing the Russian government for the invasion, you also have to know that there is already a lot of media restriction in Russia. So we need independent platforms where people can access information. And when you begin to put policies in place that seems to target the countries, or that seems to suggest that you are biased, you are creating more basis for restriction of few independent platform that people access information that still exists, like the Instagram, like the Facebook, and like the Twitter and all of that. So I think that Facebook didn't need to take that decision. Facebook should have stuck to its policy so that it will not be seen as directly interfering in the conflict. But I think Meta in that context saw itself more as responding to the decision of the Western government to impose sanctions on Facebook, on Russia. And I think that was why they went in that direction. But I don't think it was necessary. As a matter of fact, we at Paradigm Initiative, we joined a global coalition of civil society organization to write to the U.S. government and a few other governments across the world to say they have to be very careful in terms of the kind of sanctions they are imposing, because the internet infrastructure is a global infrastructure, and you don't want to take decision that does not, that will harm even independent journalists, that will harm ordinary citizens, that will harm people that are at least letting the world see verifiable information. Because like I said, Russia is very big on propaganda. So you don't want to close the remaining spaces that at least give us a chance to get a sense of what is happening in Russia right now. We saw on live TV, a woman walk to live TV, for example, on social media, how a woman walk on live TV, carrying a placard. Those are the kind of information that could be shot, that the world could be shut away from if we don't have if platforms that are still, showing independent news.
All right, Maya, but I mean, given all of these, that Boy has said, Maya, would you say they've taken sides in all of this?
Yes, clearly, of course. Meta has taken side in this particular war in Russia, and it's basically not unexpected, if you ask me. One of the things that I've sort of noticed is that the U.S. government is trying to use everything at its disposal to fight Russia, and one of those ways has to be social media. The U.S. government knows that the social media infrastructure, in quotes, the big guys within social media space belong, in quotes, to the US. So they are trying to use their position in that space to try to change what narrative is around that side. There were even stories that they invited TikTok influencers to explain to them that this is what is happening, this is where we want you to take it from, this is what we want you to tell your people. So I feel like the social media giants have taken sides, but I would also say that at this point, it's almost impossible for them to just sit back and let everything flow like that, considering that both parties, and of course maybe in my own line of duty, I've seen that it's actually both parties that are taking advantage of social media giants to push their own propaganda.
So let me just let me just quickly quote Meta's spokesperson. Said, as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have temporarily made allowances for forms of political expression that would normally violate our rules, like violent speech such as death to the Russian invaders. We still won't allow credible calls for violence against Russian civilians. So how easy, going by this statement now, how easy is it, controlling people's narratives online?
I think that when we say controlling narratives, there's a lot that goes into it. Now, there are many people whose narrative online is actually being controlled, but they don't know it because they belong in a sort of an ecosystem or an echo chamber where what they are receiving, what they are reading, what they are seeing takes a certain angle. And before they know what's happening, there's a confirmation bias. You from your own daily life, from things that are happening, from what you're seeing, you begin to tweet or you begin to share a post on Instagram or TikTok about a certain situation that you think it's your genuine thoughts, and you will not be wrong to say so, but that is what has been fed to you in a very subtle manner. So when we say that they don't want to adjust narratives and all that, it's a very slippery place. It's sort of that you can't particularly say you are doing this or you're not.
So how do we change that now? How do we change that kind of mindset, so to speak, or that kind of behavior?
So I think that for everybody who is following this conflict, the first thing you need to put at the back of your mind is that when it comes to information, no party is right or no party is wrong. We've seen videos where they say is the Russian invaders killing Ukrainians and all that. And by the time we did some analysis on video, we found that they were even Ukrainian tanks that were actually doing what was said to be. So, but going by our existing bias that the Russians are known for propaganda, what they did in the US elections and some other situations like that around the world, we would naturally approach it to think that, the Russians would have done this. But one way to deal with it is for every information you see online about the war, approach it as not supporting any side. It could be Russians that are putting this out, could be the Ukrainians. Let me look deeper into this video. Let me look deeper into this picture. Let me search more about this. And that's where you find your information.
All right, Boy, let me, since we're looking at all of this, Boy, most of the, what's it called, the social media, companies, we've seen even tech companies kind of withdraw from Russia. And your work at Paradigm Initiative, mostly looks at, inclusion. So if we're looking at all of that, I mean, also looking at the fact that in their policies, inclusion is kind of one of the things that, most of these tech companies usually look up to or look out for. This is pretty much a violation of their own rules. What can be done, to take this off, so to speak, now?
So, in this context, like I said, and I also, Mayowa also, confirmed that there's a lot of Western influence in the ownership structure of not just social media platform, even in the internet infrastructure itself, because internet started from the US. So that kind of affects also regulatory practices, and also in terms of responses to the development in Ukraine and Russia. However, we believe very strongly in the line of our work that the social media platforms have no business, taking sides because of their significance. If they are going to maintain their global significance, they must not be seen to be taking sides in circumstances like that. And it's our duty to call them out, to call them their attention to that. As a matter of fact, the quote by the Meta spokesperson, when I first read it, I didn't believe it that they could have said such a thing, because I felt that was such a wrong statement to put out. Because just like Maiwa also said about this information, when you're in situations like this, it's not a battle of angel versus devil. On both sides, there are angels and there are devils. Many people will commit war crimes on both sides. So you have to be very conscious of that. And that is why you cannot afford to be biased. I mean, you just have to maintain that neutrality as much as possible. So just to, then touch the art of your question regarding inclusion. It doesn't help the objective of inclusion when you now begin to say, oh, because there is a war in this place, we are going to restrict access. The idea is never to restrict access. Anytime an African government restricts access, we are always speaking against it, say, don't restrict access for whatever reason, because we need to be able to see both narrative as objectively as possible. Once we begin to restrict access, we are making it difficult for us to see both sides of the story. That means one side will control the narrative, and we are able to run away with a narrative, confirmation bias, because we create an echo chamber for ourselves by cutting out some people out of the conversation. We need every side into the conversation, and internet infrastructure is just like a power infrastructure. You don't cut such an important infrastructure of in the guise or for the excuse of obeying some sanctions and all of that. It is a global infrastructure, and it has to be left to be global, because one of the impacts or unintended consequences of this is that you are going to now create a system whereby what we have as a global infrastructure will now be segmented, because we all talk about digital sovereignty and how it is problematic to have what we call digital sovereignty, but you cannot be doing things like this and not expect countries to start pushing for digital sovereignty. What will happen after this war is that there will be a lot of more push for digital sovereignty. So Russia will have its own internet, China will have its own internet, Nigeria will have its own internet, and all of that. So that fragmentation is not what we want to see. We want the world to remain open. We want the internet to, that's the beauty of the internet. The openness of the internet is this beauty. But this is going to, cut back on all effort to promote that openness. So as a matter of fact, we have reached out. We continue to reach out to say that you cannot do this. You have become a global corporation and you have to operate like that. You are not a Western. Yeah.
So just as we wind down, what would you expect, that social media companies like Meta, be doing at this point in time, and where should their policies be directed to or at?
So first, from my perspective, this is not the time to start bending rules, bending policies. They should have just stuck with what their policy says. If this war teaches them a lesson, I mean, they can take the lesson and, after the war, use the opportunity to improve on their policy. But when you begin to, moderate policy in the middle of a war, that means you are shifting your goalposts and you are clearly demonstrating your bias. So right now, they need to maintain their neutrality and operate as a global corporation. And more importantly, there's also a need for them to consult very widely. There are also human rights organizations in Russia. There are human rights organizations in Ukraine as well, and people who have a lot of expertise on this issue. So they should be consulting very deeply and not just leaning on Western bias for decision making. They are not they don't represent just Western interests. They have to be a neutral platform. So in situations like this, I expect them to talk more to civil society organizations, to journalists, for those who are working, independently on these issues, to get ideas on what role they can play that is more objective in situations like this.
All right, Maiwa, also, so what should we be doing now when we see videos, out there? Maybe they might call them, the Russian forces bombarding, a Ukrainian plane. We've seen such videos. So how do we now spot the correct videos? What should we be doing?
The first thing that we need to do is, first, if you're interested in getting information about this war, you should do it as much as possible from official channels. And when I say official channels, you also have to be careful not to create an echo chamber. So, for example, as a journalist and fact checker, what I do is I follow all the news agencies, all the verified news agencies from Russia. I follow the verified news agencies from Ukraine. I follow Western stories. I follow Turkish stories. Yeah. So that way, it gives me, there's perspective. It gives me, so once a policy is announced, the way the Russian guys will report it will be different from, for example, when they were talking about ceasefire, when they were trying to negotiate and all that, how the Russians were reporting was different from how the Ukrainians were reporting it. So when you get that kind of information, because you've seen both sides of the report, it gives you a clearer picture of what exactly is happening. And then, of course, when you get videos, especially videos that are subtitled, and I keep emphasizing on that, if you cannot hear what they're saying, if it's a subtitled video that you're receiving, there is a very high probability that that video has been altered to say what was not said. So it will do some good to search. And of course, this is also where the kind of problems with social media giants come in. Some of these Russian titles have been blocked from YouTube. So I've seen a situation where I find a video on Facebook. It says ABC. And then when I did my search and everything, I found the video on YouTube. It said XYZ. I found out that they were not saying the same thing. But the point where it was blocked. So when I find a video here, I cannot check it here because information is not readily available on that side. So I think these are the issues. The social media guys need to open up the space, and then anybody who gets a video should also want to do a little check before sharing.
Okay. All right, I have to say thank you. This is where we would have to bring the conversation to an end. Mayowa Tijani, lead fact-checking journalist, AFP Fact Check, as well as Boye Adegoke, Senior Program Manager at Paradigm Initiative. Thank you guys for joining us on the program today and sharing your thoughts. Well, Amarachi and Millicent, this is where I'll hand it over back to you guys to continue the show.
Thank you, Victor, and very interesting conversation we're having there with Mayowa and Tijani. Now, according to the United Nations, the number of refugees who fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion began on February 24 has topped 2.9 million. The UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, says over 2.9 million refugees have now left the country, according to data from the 14th of March 2022, up another 110,000 from Sunday, making it the largest refugee exodus in Europe since World War II.
UNICEF said more than 1 million children had fled Ukraine in search of safety and protection. The UNHCR initially estimated that up to 4 million people could leave, but last week admitted that the figure might well be revised upwards.
Now, before the conflict, Ukraine had a population of 37 million people in regions under government control, excluding Russia-annexed Crimea and the pro-Russian separatist regions in the east. The UN's International Organization for Migration says people continue to flee the war in Ukraine every minute. From neighboring countries, Poland has received one of the largest, which is over 1.8 million refugees.
And Ukrainians also, over 260,000, have entered Hungary, while over 213,000 have fled to Slovakia, according to the UNHCR data. Moldova also received over 300,000. We have Slovakia receiving over 213,000 refugees. The sheer amount of people fleeing have driven locals in neighboring nations to provide relief where possible to help alleviate some of the stress and emotions attached to leaving Ukraine. Some Polish communities are also helping strangers get settled with basic necessities, including strollers, diapers for young children.
Over in Germany, nearly 123,000 refugees arrived as of Saturday, according to the Interior Ministry. However, due to the absence of border checks between Poland and Germany, where most Ukrainian refugees are coming from, the actual number of incoming refugees could be significantly higher, according to a spokesperson. Mayor Franziska Giffey in Berlin has become a major hub. The mayor says Berlin has become a major hub for refugees from Ukraine. Over the previous 3 days, more than 13,000 refugees have arrived in Berlin by train or bus, likely arriving also by car.
We're also seeing refugees fleeing Ukraine that have arrived France. The French citizenship minister says over 7,000, mostly women and children, have entered the country. The interior minister admits that France has seen 3,000 arrivals in the previous 2 days. Of course, we know what's happening in the UK. British Home Secretary telling lawmakers that Ukrainians with passports would no longer need to go to a visa processing centre, but we understand over 760 visas have been granted by the UK.
Now, across Europe, nations including Austria, Croatia, Estonia, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Portugal and Sweden have each reported thousands of Ukrainians arriving. Across the Atlantic, though, Canada and the United States have both offered their support. Canada announcing it would fast-track Ukrainian applications for both temporary and permanent residency status, as well as family reunification applications. Canada is already home to the world's largest Ukrainian diaspora after Russia, with more than 1 million Canadians who claim Ukrainian heritage. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has pledged to support addressing the massive flow of migrants coming from Ukraine and says the U.S. is willing to take in more migrants.
And surprisingly, data also showing that additional over 160,000 people moved to the Russian Federation from Donetsk and Luhansk regions between February and March.
Well, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the world needs to wean itself off Russian oil and gas ahead of a visit to Saudi Arabia for talks later this week. He says working with Saudi Arabia and encouraging them to increase the production of oil is part of building a wide coalition to prevent Putin from succeeding in Ukraine. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries said earlier that oil demand in 2022 faces challenges from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and rising inflation as crude prices soar.
Everybody in this, I think that we've got a global crisis in which it's obvious that the Russian aggression in Ukraine has helped to trigger a spike in the price of hydrocarbons, a spike in the price of oil. And it is vital, if we're going to stand up to Putin's bullying, if we're going to avoid being blackmailed by Putin in the way that so many Western countries sadly have been, we've got to get ourselves off Russian hydrocarbons. They're a massive part of the global market for hydrocarbons. They help to drive the price. We need to talk to other producers around the world about how we can move away from that dependency. Vladimir Putin over the last years has been like a pusher, feeding an addiction in Western countries to his hydrocarbons, to his oil and gas. We need to get ourselves off that addiction. I think that what the world is seeing is the return in Ukraine to the kind of brutality, the kind of absolutely indiscriminate bombing of civilian centres, of great cities that we last saw in the European continent 80 years ago. This is quite unbelievable what is happening now in our continent, and we need to make sure that we build the strongest, widest possible coalition to ensure that Vladimir Putin does not succeed, that we wean ourselves off Russian hydrocarbons, and that's what the UK is helping to do.
Metropolitan Opera has held a benefit concert to support Ukraine. With 3 huge yellow and blue Ukraine flags draped across the front of the house, the 70-minute program titled A Concert for Ukraine began with 23-year-old Ukrainian bass baritone Vladislav Boyarsky, a soloist in front of the Met Orchestra and chorus, and music director Yannick Nizet-Seguin, starting the 90-minute program with Ukraine's Ukraine's national anthem.
Other performances included a prayer for Ukraine and Va Pensiero from Nabucco. Ticket proceeds will go to various relief efforts in Ukraine. Enjoy.
Have you ever tried singing opera?
No, haven't gone that far. But it does bring a lot of hope, I believe, you know, and it will bring a lot of hope to Ukrainians who maybe listen or maybe watching.
Definitely.
Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
I'm Millicent Nwaka. Have a good evening.